Do you ever look at some people and think, boy, they've got it made? Or maybe you arrive at a function and there is a group, a crowd, a throng, nay, a host of people gathered, and they all look good. They've all got on nice clothes. They've done their hair. They're wearing good shoes. They know how to behave. Nobody's gesticulating. They're all keeping their voices to a minimum. But it's a crowd of, as my grandmother would say, good people. Have you ever arrived at that? You know those crowds? I need some signs. Do you know these crowds? Yes, no, I've never seen them. I don't get out much. I mean, something. Us. Spirit's moving. So this is not the crowd Jesus finds. There, how's that? That's not the crowd Jesus finds in today's lectionary. The crowd that Jesus finds, 5,000 of them. And the text says 5,000 men, and there were women and children. So add to it. So 5,000 men, and in the lectionary, our editors cut and paste, remember, in the lectionary. So what they've left out is a whole feeding of the 5,000. So there's been a whole miracle that we just it got lost. But remember that there are 5,000 people, and they're clamoring to see Jesus. And they're not well dressed. And they are not good people. And their hair is wild and crazy. And they probably smell bad. And they don't have good manners. And they are desperate to get to Jesus. 5,000 of them, just the men. 5,000. That's who's on the shore waiting for Jesus. Word has gotten out that Jesus is healing people. Word has gotten out that he's doing miracles. Word has gotten out that his disciples are doing some cool things too. And he's like the Beatles. And you can't get off the boat with Jesus and not be marauded by throngs of people who are coming out. And they're bringing their sick, and they're bringing their lame, and they're bringing their blind, and they're saying, heal in Jesus. And Jesus is a healing factory. And he is going around and he is healing everything that's been put in his way. And they are lining the streets, and they are all over the marketplaces, and they are just sick people everywhere. And Jesus heals them. 5,000 people. And Jesus is in the boat, and he looks at the shore, and I love this line in Mark. And he looks at the shore, and the writer says, and Jesus had compassion on the crowd. Jesus actually never, that's like one of the only times that's ever said. Jesus had compassion on the crowds because he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. He felt sorry for them because they were vulnerable and leaderless and empty and clamoring for something. And so he feeds the 5,000 of them, and they're still hungry because they're not hungry for food. They're starving for something more. And they know that Jesus has it. There is such hunger. And there's such hunger among that crowd on the shore of the sea. And that hunger is what you and I feel as well. And it's what brings us to Jesus. Hungry. And the throngs press in on every side, desperate for what Jesus offers. And we too are hungry for the kingdom of God. Fulfillment, equity, righteousness, the rightness amidst the brokenness of the earthly world. We are famished for the kingdom of God. My grandfather loved grocery stores. And my grandfather went pretty much every day to Piggly Wiggly. Now, mind you, I grew up in the Deep South, so my Southerners, you feel me. So the Piggly Wiggly is in the Deep South, the center of our community. It is where all decisions are made. It is where you see everybody. And my grandfather would drive into town to the Piggly Wiggly, and it would take Granddaddy 2 hours to get out of the grocery store. And I never understood why it took my grandfather 2 hours to go grocery shopping. He would say, "Oh, darling, I just need some eggs," and he would go to town. My grandfather had chickens. He didn't need eggs. But it was his excuse to go to town. And he would go to the Piggly Wiggly, and he would see everybody he ever needed to see. And they would see him. And 2 hours later, he would come out with something in his arms. Something. It didn't matter, but something. My grandfather lived alone. And this was his way of keeping his social connections in this small Mississippi town. And then, when I was in junior high, a new grocery store opened on the bypass. And this store called the Market. The Market was one of those that was a big box grocery store. And they had all of the extras, not in the back. No, they had all of the extra supplies up. They had it on the top of the shelves. So you knew that there was no scarcity. In fact, you knew that they would never run out of Eggo waffles because you could see them. You could see crates of them up in the freezers. And my grandfather thought he had died and gone to heaven. And so, now mind you, he still went to Piggly Wiggly. But he also then went to the market. Because at the market, and this is what we discovered, at the market, they gave out samples. And at the market, my grandfather would go aisle to aisle to aisle and sample things he never knew existed. My grandfather came home with veggie patties. My grandfather did not know a vegetarian. He had never met one. He all of a sudden decided it tasted good, so he came home with a package of veggie patties. My grandfather at one point came home with a package of pot stickers. He didn't know what they were, but he had had them in the samples, and they were really good, and he decided he needed to have them. My grandfather never passed up anything new, ever. If there was a sign on the package that says new and improved, he decided he better see for himself. He bought it. Nothing lost on my grandfather. He was a marketer's dream. Tell him he needed it, he decided he did, and he brought it home. We used to laugh at my grandfather, and then I realized I go to Costco the same way. I go around and I get the samples and they're really good, and I decide, well, certainly I need probably 5 pounds of cheese because that was really good cheese in the first place. I never knew I needed it. But beyond that, it's because we have an insatiable hunger, and not for food. We have an insatiable hunger for something that's more, and we're always looking for it. We have an unslaked thirst. We're always thirsty for something. We're always looking for something. We're always hungry for something. We constantly pursue things. What more do we need, my brothers and sisters, than food and shelter and companionship? But we constantly seek to fill our lives with everything else that there is. What is the difference between the words need and want? What is the difference between the words need and want? The things that we want are not bad in and of themselves. But ask the question when we buy them, when we pursue them, when we sacrifice other things in order to pursue. What is it we fill? What is the hunger we seek to satisfy? When we constantly seek other things, experiences, relationships, things, tangibles, intangibles, cars, businesses, houses, memberships, all the things we seek, what are we feeding? Because you and I both know that once we get them, we'll keep seeking. Because we'll never ever be satisfied. We'll never feel that hunger. We will, like my grandfather, go every day to the store. to fill the hunger that we have. But the crowds that clamor around Jesus, those crowds that press in on him, demanding innumerable persons that are fed by Jesus' miraculous ministry, and Jesus tells them what they need. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells them, that's all you need, folks, that right there, the Sermon on the Mount. That's all you need in life. And he tells this crowd that. And they're good for a while. Just like you and I are good for a while. And then we lose interest. And then it becomes harder. And then we get distracted and something else happens. And we all of a sudden turn our attention to something else. And we pursue a new goal and a diet. You know, we start one today and tomorrow I haven't lost any weight. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. We're constantly pursuing something because that's going to be hard and that's going to be too much. We lose interest. But we never, ever satiate our hunger. We keep consuming the things that will fill us and then leave us empty. And fill us again and then leave us empty. We long for wholeness. We long not to be hungry. And it is only God who can fill that hunger. Jesus in this morning's gospel, Jesus and his disciples go about their miraculous healings and teachings, and the crowds come from everywhere to respond to the hunger that Jesus feeds. And you know what the crowd does after a little while is they're all good and like you and I, and they're all dedicated, and then one by one they'll start dropping off. And pretty soon Jesus in his gospel, he keeps attracting a real crowd. The farther the gospel goes, the crowds get bigger and bigger and bigger, and Jesus gets a big following, and then we get to Jerusalem, and we start looking at the cross, and you know what happens to the followers when you start looking at the cross is that they start peeling away, one by one, and so ultimately this huge wave of momentum throughout the gospel ends in Mark, and Jesus is on the cross by himself, because nobody else is going to be with him. Because everybody wants what Jesus has. And then they realize, whoa, that's a heavy load. You and I are the crowd, of course. We press in on Jesus at all sides, and we say, Jesus, give me, Jesus, give me. It's just this one time, Jesus, I promise I'll never. That's the Santa Claus, Jesus. And we say it all the time. Because following Jesus is hard. Because filling the hunger is hard. Because if we ever fill the hunger easily, we'll just get hungry again. That's why fast food is so terrible. Because it feeds the hunger, and it goes away real fast. There will be a time, my friend, there will be a time that the kingdom of God comes. And there will be a time when we finally are no longer hungry. But in the meantime, while we hunger for the only thing that Jesus can give, fullness and wholeness, and while we miss the mark, we always remember that there is grace, and that there is a mystical power offered at the table before us just minutes from now. Mystical power that gives us the sustenance to continue our devotion to an ultimate reality when Christ's great kingdom will come on earth. Kingdom of love and light, to borrow the words of the old hymn. My prayer this week, brothers and sisters, is that we consider our hunger, is that we consider the voids we seek to fill and the methods by which we fill them, only to be dissatisfied and hungry later. And in considering the appetites we seek to satiate, consider the grace offered by Christ, the only source I can offer to fill a void that never leaves us wanting.